and then people will join whenever.
All right.
Awesome.
All right, so I guess there's a lot of people that don't know you on this who've joined. So this is Max Raginsky. He is a professor of ECE
Yep.
at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he's gonna give us this talk on the Soviet roots of AI. So go nuts.
All right. Well, Alina, thanks a lot. I mean, this is a wonderful idea. And you know, when you floated this idea early on, at first I was kind of another Zoom talk, and I thought this is actually something nice to break the monotony of, you know, days blending into other days and teaching online and stuff. And this is also a chance for me to indulge some of my interests and passions, and also, you know, give a talk where there's not a single equation,
Very
and
exciting.
mostly talk and mostly talk about sort of some interesting historical things that I've always been kind of obsessed with. Um, and so I plan to talk for about 45 minutes. I made just enough slides for that, and just to keep myself honest, I'm going to start a timer. But basically, so this talk is about some sort of history of ideas in AI and machine learning that eventually made their way to modern mainstream, brave new world that we're all, part of. So, all right. So what's machine learning anyway? If I were to describe it, it's about programming computers to become better or more successful at some given task on the basis of experience. And so this is a kind of a purely pragmatic thing, right? You know, you specify a task like machine translation, image recognition, text understanding, speech analysis, what have you. There are criteria of success that, relate to us humans as users, and experience comes in the form of data that we feed to this program. And the most important part here is that the program is not, this computer program is not supposed to have the rules or the skills fed to it. It's supposed to somehow engage in this process of self-modification and get better at this task as it goes on. And there are actually a lot of interesting philosophical questions here. And, that actually could be a subject of another talk. And okay, so I'm talking about philosophy. That's because I'm old and I have tenure, so I can think about philosophy instead of trying to publish and jump in the old hamster wheel. So philosophical questions are pretty interesting. So the first one that really kind of enters is the problem of induction. How do you know that things that you observe in the world are really causally related? And this was, your English and Scottish empiricists, so Hume and Locke. And Hume in particular was completely skeptical about this. He said, well, there's no causality that you could infer as a puny human. You just observe things that occur together, and for all practical purposes, you might as well assume, that there's some sort of a cause and effect relationship. But there's no way, he argued, to go from particular to the general. Then there are the German idealists like Kant, and to Kant it was like, well, our mind actually has some a priori concepts that allow us to structure our experience and observations, and therefore impose causal relations on the world, which was actually closer to the way we think about it now in this kind of a pragmatic sense. It doesn't matter what there really is, as long as we can actually observe the consequences, and it's useful for us. Right. And then there's another problem, which is, well, if we start imposing mathematical structures on the world, we run the risk of confusing them for something that is really out there, as opposed to something that just relates to us in our living. So this is Edmund Husserl, sort of the father of phenomenology. Ironically, I think the term lived experience that is now fashionable comes from, I believe, a French translation of Husserl's notion of life world. But anyway, so this is all philosophy, and it's cool. But since we're talking about Soviet roots of all of these ideas, it is not surprising that dialectical materialism, at least in its Soviet Stalinist version, will make an appearance. Anyway, so let's first talk about some milestones. So the first important text is Norbert Wiener's manifesto, I guess, called Cybernetics, or the science, I think it's called the science of communication and feedback in man, animal, and machine, or something along these lines. So the reason why I say it's a manifesto is it was a book that was popular. It was a bestseller, but it's full of mathematical theorems and formulas, and it also kind of rambles on. He starts again from from discussing philosophy. He talks about Newton and Bergson, and then he talks about group theory and symmetries and stuff like that. And then he goes into the problem of universals and the Gestalt, and then he talks about his experiments on on frogs with colleagues who were neurophysiologists. So the book really jumps all over the place. Along the way, he talks about using logic and systems that use feedback. Feedback is this notion that you perform a task, you do something, and then you get a signal from the world that tells you how close you are to success. And he argues that, well, if you endow a system with capability of, absorb information and act on it and receive feedback, then you can do almost anything. And this was 1948. Computing wasn't really a thing to the same extent that it is now. Digital computers were only then sort of starting to be implemented. Most of the computers were analog, meaning that you had to actually work with pretty messy moving wires around or setting values of resistors or whatever. But the book was a bestseller, and here he is. It's really my favorite photo of Wiener. Here he is with a mechanical, electromechanical device that he was trying to illustrate some of these ideas, and he's smoking a cigar, and he was kind of a short and stocky individual who was also a child prodigy. So his father apparently had this whole idea that this is how you raise brilliant children. You start educating them from an early age, and so I believe Wiener graduated with a bachelor's degree at a fairly tender age, and then he ended up at Harvard, and then he ended up at University of Cambridge, where he worked with Bertrand Russell. They didn't like each other at all, but Russell actually recognized the talent. The other important book is by another American prodigy, Claude Shannon. So this was Theory of Information, Mathematical Theory of Communication, also 1948. And this book actually set the stage for thinking about the digital communication, what we use now in terms of ones and zeros, communicating information error free. And a lot of people actually misinterpret this as saying that we don't care about meaning or semantics of information. We only care about preserving the ones and zeros. But it's actually deeper than that. I don't want to get into that, but that. The point is that this was also a watershed moment. And the fact that these two books came out at about the same year is kind of important, for the history of a variety of fields. Now, let me go back to the Soviet Union. So Stalin is still alive. This is 1950. And essentially, science in the Soviet era is a very strange affair because some areas of science, like nuclear physics, were more or less protected by the state, and the scientists were given free rein to work on their problems as long as you could get the atomic bomb to the Soviet leadership. But other sciences, like let's say biology, didn't fare so well. And this was the reason why people like Lysenko, for example, were able to gain a foothold and such an influence was because they knew how to co-opt this official Soviet version of, I guess you could call it Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, because Stalin actually, he wrote treatises on these things. So in particular, this notion of dialectical materialism and historical materialism, was actually written in a book by Stalin. I mean, he's listed as the author. I don't know whether it was ghost written or not, but he apparently fancied himself, a real deep thinker. And so the Soviet version of what you call dialectical materialism was very strange because it contained a whole bunch of formulas that you could sort of manipulate and combine at will and reach almost any conclusion you want. And this was mostly practiced by these official philosophers of the Soviet state. And there was like an official journal called Вопросы философии, Problems of Philosophy, that could be used to sort of, like either either sort of extol or bring down any discipline. Cybernetics happened to be one of these sciences that sort of, for a while was attacked. Here's a scan of an article in Литературная газета, literary newspaper, by a fellow named Boris Agapov. But his whole thing was, find really ridiculous, over-the-top discussion of something in Western press and write it up for the Soviet audiences. Apparently, he had a real gift for this, for satirizing various things. So this article is called Mark III, the Calculator, which was based on a machine built at Harvard. So on the right, we see the cover of Time magazine from 1948. So this is about this computer built at Harvard, and of course the article that the cover referred to was called "Thinking Machines," and it contained all sorts of really starry-eyed pronouncements about how soon all sorts of processes in business and administration and economy and military planning and science can be supplanted by machines. So this article, even though none of the primary sources were consulted by the author, it made fun of this over the type hype in Western press, and essentially contained all the names like Wiener, Shannon, and people like that, attributed really nonsensical statements to them, or statements taken out of context. But because this was Литературная газета that was widely read by the Soviet intelligentsia, this more or less reflected the Soviet consensus on these things. Doesn't really talk about cybernetics. People were aware of Wiener's book, but it was never really translated. It was available to select few, particularly in the military-industrial complex, and I'll talk about that after a while. But in 1952, there was another article in Литературная газета called "Cybernetics: The Science," in quotes, of obscurantists. And this one really denounced cybernetics as some sort of a pseudoscience because it doesn't have a purely materialist basis as the Soviets understood it. And obviously with Wiener talking about Hume and Locke and Bergson, there's you could basically label it as idealist and formalist and mechanist, whatever you want. These labels were just used by the ideological philosophers in the Soviet Union as they saw fit. The interesting thing about this particular article is it was written by Mikhail Yarashevsky, who himself was a victim of ideological sort of persecution. He was a linguist, and he happened to be an adherent of a linguistic school that at the time was out of favor. There was a linguist named Marr who had some interesting, ideas at the time about, certain formal features of languages, and somehow his doctrines were denounced as formalist and mechanist and, excessively mathematized, which meant that you couldn't really talk about, real concerns of whatever it is, transition of quantity to quality, or whatever the dogmas of Stalinist, dialectical materialism were. So he wrote this article partly to curry favor with the authorities and to sort of get back in their good graces. This is 1952, so genetics, of course, was completely denounced and taken over by Lysenko and his fellow travelers. Cybernetics was also denounced, but because things like computing and defense were tightly linked together in the Soviet Union, this denunciation didn't last long, and anyway, something happened in 1953 that kind of put a stop to this, at least temporarily. So what happened in 1953 is Stalin died. And so, interestingly enough, it seemed like all of this philosophical jockeying for positions was not really centralized. There were various factions who knew how to deploy these doctrines to their advantage. So the idea was it was more like the magical arts as opposed to anything scientific, which of course was claimed to this is scientific Marxism or whatever it was. It was anything but. The adherents of that could um, pronounce anything they wanted by just proper quote mining from all the original sources, but somehow they lost the upper hand. Um, and so to talk about that, let's first see what happens at the time in the West. So this is when artificial intelligence, in fact, the term artificial intelligence was coined by McCarthy, who was one of the leaders in computing and programming languages. This was a time of really bizarre optimism. In 1956, a group of scientists in the U.S. said we're going to have this 10-week workshop at Dartmouth where we're going to solve all these problems. We think that anything that that humans can accomplish, any intelligent process, any creative process, anything of that sort can be implemented by computers, and we're going to set out and actually prove this and discuss how it's going to happen. So this was a proposal for some funding to run this workshop at Dartmouth in 1956. So and when I say paradigms, I really mean this like in a rigorous sense of Thomas Kuhn, who came up with this whole notion of paradigms. There are really two paradigms at the time, connectionists and symbolists. So connectionists were sort of really epitomized by a really interesting character, Frank Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist, by description, but he was really well versed in engineering. Here he is shown on the left, working with one of the proto neural nets called one of the perceptrons. So it was a massive wires, and you had to modify the operation of this machine by moving these wires around and connecting them to different slots. So connectionism was this idea that you could probably implement all of these processes computationally, but you have to take cues from the current findings in neurophysiology and neuroscience, where the idea was that the brain is a really flexible system that acquires experience and proficiency at things by sort of adaptively rewiring, building connections between neurons. The notions of neurons and synapses were around at the time, and Rosenblatt essentially said, just give me a system that's really flexible, a lot of room to maneuver, and we can implement all sorts of things. Obviously, computational capabilities at the time were not exactly great, which is where the opening of the symbolic school really symbolized, let's kind of pun intended, by McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. They disagreed with this after some initial sort of experimentation with connectionism, and again, limitations of technology were what they were. The symbolists said, well, let's actually work with logic. Why would we work with these messy, brain inspired squishy things when we can abstract from that and actually use logic and think about intelligence as this kind of a sequential process where you methodically go through various premises, eliminate things that don't make sense. So it's a process of reasoning. Essentially, the symbolists in the West kind of had the upper hand for a while, and so all the funding and accolades flowed to them. In the Soviet Union, things were slightly different. So what happened in 1955 is that this, official organ of, Marxist philosophy, Вопросы философии, published two articles. One was called "What is Cybernetics" by a fellow named Ernst Kollmann, and the other was, Basic Features of Cybernetics by three people who were, first of all, tightly involved with the military-industrial complex, applied mathematics for military projects. So Sobolev, who was also an accomplished mathematician, Lyapunov, who was actually related to another brilliant Russian mathematician with the same name, who came up with some basic ideas in like theory of stability, and Anatoly Kitov, who was, I think, an admiral in the Soviet Navy. So, and these articles actually kind of made cybernetics acceptable and no longer taboo. The irony here is that a few years before that, Ernst Kollmann wrote one of the articles in the same magazine denouncing cybernetics from Marxist positions. And this was actually this was the beginning of denunciation of Stalin, and Khrushchev came to power. This is the beginning of the thaw, and this started kind of this push towards, you call it in quotes, de-ideologization. And it's in quotes because you still had to pay lip service to all of the doctrines, but scientists were more or less left to themselves. They no longer had to have this stuff vetted by somebody with a degree in scientific Marxism. They were trusted to come up with all the ideas themselves. And interestingly enough, if during this Stalin's era, post-war period, various theories could be denounced as formalist, mechanist, or idealist, sometimes all three, even though it's contradiction in terms. There was this interesting formula that was actually deployed very skillfully by Lysenko, that mathematization is actually a tool of obscuring class interests, or whatever you may call it. The backlash among the cyberneticists in the Soviet Union was, well, the problem with all of this is that these people who write for Vопросы philosophy, they can manipulate these little, it's like this weird glass bead game. They can arrive at any conclusion they want. We want to use mathematics because it makes things unambiguous and crisp. Again, this should be taken with a grain of salt, because you still have to abide by all the rules and pay lip service, and have all the right quotes in the right places. But at least mathematization was used as some sort of an interesting buffer between science and ideology. And like I said, the fact that military industrial complex was heavily invested in computing at the time, and a lot of work was done in secret, that played a role in bringing us to the mainstream. Long story short, 1958, so 10 years after Wiener's original book, saw the official Russian translation of Wiener's book, and the first original Russian book on cybernetics by somebody named Igor Poletaev, who was again involved with the military, but he was also an engineer. And the book is actually pretty cool. You can find it in various sources, and look at the illustrations, and they look really interesting. So why am I talking about cybernetics? It's because so what happened in the Soviet Union is that while in the West there was this kind of paradigm shift for a while from connectionists, like the early neural networks, to the logic-based ideas. In the Soviet Union, somehow they were a lot broader in their interests, and all of a sudden, all these ideas that were floating around, in all sorts of areas of Soviet research, were allowed to be exploited. Like, for example, here, one of the pictures I have is from a book by Nikolai Bernstein, who was one of the students of Pavlov. So Pavlov's ideas about conditioned reflexes were, for some reason, part of mainstream Marxist teachings. Bernstein modified it. He said that reflexes are not just unidirectional. There's like this feedback, right? You do something and you receive the signal from the environment that what you're doing is maybe slightly off the mark, so you adjust your behavior. It's completely non-controversial, but somehow this notion that your consciousness creates part of your reality was completely sort of alien to dialectical materialism work. There was no role for consciousness. Everything is the movement of matter. But the point is that these ideas, which were sort of denounced at the time, came back to the fore. And so the Soviet incarnation of cybernetics was a lot sort of more varied in its outlook. So whereas in the West, cybernetics became sort of almost this very narrow field having to do with just engineering of control systems. In the Soviet Union, once the floodgates opened, they wanted to subsume everything, and this included logic and computation, which is a big deal. Again, there was a literal race between the West and the Soviet bloc in terms of computer technologies. In fact, the first European computer with a stored program was built in Kiev. But the point is that these specialized magazines and journals started appearing. One of them shown here, called Проблемы кибернетики, which had sections on general cybernetics, mathematical linguistics, programming, logic, communication, information, what have you. And and I have a bunch of those just downloaded, and it's fascinating to read how many of these ideas later, influenced a lot of interesting developments. So anyway, by the way, so I'm aiming here for like I'll talk for, like I said, about 45 minutes, and then maybe we can have like questions about this. But if somebody has anything to ask, we can do it now. All right, but the point is that this is actually something, again, to the credit of Soviet researchers, they somehow were not interested in playing these faction games between connectionism and logic. They said, we're going to take it all, we're going to synthesize it, which of course is has always been one of the attractive things about Russian or Soviet science and engineering. This notion that you don't have to pick and choose, you can synthesize things. Anyway, so let's see what's going on here. So as I said, you could do almost anything you wanted as long as you had proper quotes. So here is one of the first books. This is Alexei Ivakhnenko, who worked in Kiev. So he wrote a book called Technical Cybernetics in 1962. This is a fragment. This is the preface from the book. At the top, actually, what you see, it's pretty interesting. This is what you now would recognize as a multi-layer neural net. You have an image on the right that's being sort of, scanned by some artificial retina, and then it's, some features of it are extracted, and eventually some sort of recognition, some sort of information is extracted. Ivakhnenko actually may have been one of the first engineers or scientists in the Soviet Union to have implemented sort of the first proto multi-layer deep learning type systems. But the interesting thing about this is that this preface says, cybernetics is the science of control, and as pointed out by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, we have to strive to maintain all the latest advances in science and technology for the betterment of socialist system, etc. And he also, another interesting, so again, lip service to all the proper names and ideas. But the interesting thing, again, this is what makes Soviet ideas unique, and this is what, in my opinion, sort of leads to some of the early ideas in machine learning, is that he starts with acknowledging Wiener for being one of the founding fathers of cybernetics, but he says that Wiener's notion of what constitutes a cybernetic system is something that he disagrees with. So Wiener talks about systems that incorporate sort of some sort of feedback, but on the other hand, something like a ordinary thermostat is a cybernetic system in Wiener's sense. And all a thermostat does is you set the reference temperature, and it keeps the premises roughly at that temperature by opening or closing, like some valve in the furnace. To Ivakhnenko, cybernetic system should be the one that should actually modify its operation, modify the way it interacts with the world based on experience. Wiener talks about it a little bit. This is actually where he invokes Pavlov, but then he talks about Locke and Hume. Like I said, Wiener's book is really all over the place, sort of philosophically and conceptually. But Ivakhnenko says, we're going to focus on technical aspects, but we're going to sort of really make the stipulation that cybernetic systems are in some sense systems that can learn. And this was 1962. These ideas of learning from data are only starting to be formulated both in the West and the Soviet Union. So he was one of the first. Another book is written by another researcher, Alexander Lerner. So it's called Fundamentals of Cybernetics. This book is interesting because every chapter has a quotation from somebody. And the first three chapters, so the first chapter has a quotation from a poem by Valery Brusov, who's sort of one of the Russian symbolists. The second chapter has a quotation from Marcus Aurelius, and the third chapter has a quotation from Lenin, as one must have. And the interesting thing about Lerner is that we'll see that he influenced another generation of researchers at Moscow's Institute of Control Problems, but then he himself was a dissident, and he wanted to emigrate to Israel, and he was denied, so he was one of the refuseniks, and therefore this actually led to some of his research being somewhat suppressed, and his colleagues had to find ways of reincorporating some of his ideas, even though anything he did was now essentially denounced. or at least suspect. But he wrote one of the earlier books on cybernetics as well. Again, with pretty sort of rosy prospects towards the end about building artificial or robotic systems that exceed in their intelligence their creators and whatnot. All right. So and then, but this is so far still sort of engineering. This is still the kind of control systems that you would think about like at the turn of the century, like 1920s, 1930s, with the addition of this idea that somehow the system should be able to change its structure based on experience. This is maybe the first book where the ideas of pattern recognition and classification, allowing systems to build up competence, what was proposed by another interesting fellow, Mikhail Bongard, who was a biophysicist. He worked on analyzing, color vision in animals. So I think he may have had one of the first experiments on frogs, like describing the structure of color vision. And he wrote this book in 1967 called The Problem of Recognition. It was translated 3 years later in the West under the name of pattern recognition. So he had some interesting ideas. First of all, he said, okay, what is the problem of, first of all, we're going to think about situations where, let's say, you see your friend on the street, and even though your brain, your mind, your senses register all this incoming information about your environment, you only focus on the relevant sort of aspects of the task. Like the fact that you recognized your friend makes it irrelevant whether or not you see your friend at the, against the background of a brick building or trees or whatever. Like all of these things, even though your brain may passively register them, they are irrelevant to the problem at hand. So he talked about this problem of recognition as a way of throwing out information that's useless and focusing on useful information. He tried to quantify it. So the interesting thing is that he apparently led a lab where they built some of the first Soviet programs that were doing this kind of pattern recognition. In fact, one of his earlier program was called Kara or Core for combinatorial recognition. And apparently, the reason why he was given a lot of funding to pursue these ideas was partly due to the fact that this program was used in some oil exploration and actually, helped find some oil deposits, and therefore, there was this, great Russian phrase, применение в народном хозяйстве, like usefulness in public administration. And because of that, he was given more funds, like keep working on this as long as we get something out of it. He is also known in the West for something called the Bongard problem. So his whole thing was, you can classify patterns into two classes. I give you a bunch of examples. So this is also this idea that, like you learn on the basis of experience and you get tested on it. It's an ongoing process where, you get some patterns and you're supposed to discard useless information and only focus on the useful information. So you're given like two sets of pictures. And what you're supposed to do is come up with a rule that allows you to place an unseen picture of the same type into one of the two categories. And so the book comes with, I think, 100 such problems at the end. And he basically says, well, any computer system that you claim is artificially intelligent should perform well on all these problems. And the term Bongard problem was actually popularized by Richard Hofstadter in this another bestseller, Gödel, Escher, Bach. Anyway, so he died at a fairly young age. He apparently was an expert mountaineer, and he died in a mountain climbing accident at a fairly young age. Anyway, but he was pretty instrumental in interacting with scientists from the Institute of Problems of Control, and another influential person there was Yakov Tsipkin, who wrote another book on what he called adaptation and learning. So this is actually one of the first times like the word learning was used in a title in automatic systems. And he really picked up this. So he picked up a couple of ideas. One was this notion that a learning system should modify itself based on experience, kind of gradually. So the idea is you see more things, you become more confident about your successes and failures, and that somehow leads to modification of how you're going to interact with the world later, which of course is on the one hand completely sort of biologically inspired, on the other hand, because he was a control engineer, is also natural in that context. You have systems that have, so the term at the time was self-tuning. So these systems have some sort of knobs that describe how they operate, and there's a way to choose these knob settings based on like previous experience. So his main contribution was scientific, but also sort of as an inspiration to other researchers at the Institute of Problems of Control, and they picked up these ideas. So here's a book written by three researchers working with Sipkin. Mark Eiserman, who was sort of one of the leaders in Soviet control engineering. Emmanuel Breverman, who also wrote some books on economic modeling and things like that, and Lev Rozanoyer. So this book was called "The Method of Potential Functions." Once again, it's called, so in Russian, it's called "Метод потенциальных функций в теории обучения машин." So now you see like the words machine learning appear in the title of a book. And so the diagram here is really sort of one of the first neural nets, this perceptron proposed by Rosenblatt, but they also had some interesting ideas related to sort of different types of or approaches to learning. So if you go back to Bongard, for example, you can almost think about his approach as kind of a structural linguistics approach. The idea was to come up with, essentially by observing the world, you come up with something like a dictionary, a list of nouns that you can use to anchor onto things that you see. And these nouns allow you to, I mean, again, I'm being very, very metaphorical here, allow you to discard stuff that is irrelevant to the task at hand. And so this was actually, in terms of sort of psychology of perception, this is kind of an earlier approach where what you do is you break your scene, your experience into constituents, and you work this way. But of course, like this school in psychology was supplanted by the Gestalt school, and they're like, okay, we need to look at the whole scene in its entirety. And that means that instead of talking about nouns, you have to talk about verbs, like actions. What do you do? How do you, how do you interact with the scene? This was the approach of this this triumvirate, right? This Eiserman, Breverman, Rozanoyer. So they formalized these learning rules again as something that takes place over time, right? You gradually adjust something, but this something actually is the way that you interact with with these examples that you see, like based on so let's suppose so here the idea was like when you learn to recognize, let's say, handwritten letters. So they had an example of some artificial sort of retina scanning a handwritten letter. You don't break it down into a list of attributes like, oh, a circle here, a loop there, a line there. You actually take in the scene, the object as a whole, and then by seeing enough of them, you start interacting and adjusting the performance of these systems, the structure of these systems in real time. And they actually formulated a lot of these ideas. They were based on earlier ideas of Lerner, who worked at the same institute as them, and Tsipkin, who was sort of like an inspiration. And he basically formulated two approaches to the learning problem. One was this more engineering based. The data, the examples, the real world experience comes at you sort of, in real time, and you gradually change, how you interact with it, which again is completely biologically, plausible, right? I mean, like our synaptic connections in the brain are modified all the time based on our experience. We'll never really stop processing this experience, and anything that we learned in the past is somehow stored implicitly. But this book, ironically, was never translated, even though it contains a whole lot of really interesting ideas that later sort of were either rediscovered or imported indirectly by Vapnik, who was another character in this. So another book, another approach by Vladimir Vapnik and Alexei Chervonenkis was published in 1974. And this is called now a theory of pattern recognition. The words learning were absent, but this was really sort of the beginning of modern what's called statistical learning theory. Here, this notion that your learning machine is immersed in this world that constantly interacts with it was kind of abandoned. The idea was that you're given your, experience to generalize from all at once, and you have to build a rule in order to, extrapolate to previously unseen sort of, aspects of experience. And they came up with this crucial notion, this idea that once you're given this, sort of finite description of past experience, the number of possible rules you can extract from it, even though like the number of, initial ideas may be infinite, because you're given this finite, chunk, finite record of the world, effectively it's describable in a finite manner, and you can actually quantify this idea that, okay, what happens is you are in fact discarding information that is irrelevant to you. So that's Bongard again, and they were able to quantify it. And once you quantify it, you can ask things like, okay, how many examples do I need to see of something, like let's say classifying handwritten letters or images or doing machine translation or whatever, before I become competent at this given task, right? So, kind of a really fundamental thing. Really, their ideas became a watershed moment, because at the time, computing, capabilities finally caught up with our desires, right? So for the first time, it became possible to really implement these things on digital computers. Whereas, for example, where people like Mark Eiserman and Braverman and Rosanoyer were working on their approaches, they had to work with like outdated computers and physically modify some, like analog circuit elements. Here, because of digital programs, you could actually test these algorithms and see how they work. Um, but unfortunately, Soviet cybernetics and these learning theory ideas started declining, because nothing good lasts forever. So in mid 1970s, of course, all the factions and sort of this change to Brezhnev and things like that sort of started taking its toll. A lot of these people, of course, were you probably noticed that a lot of these dramatis personae are Jewish. A lot of them had dissident thoughts. People like Lerner were actually persona non grata after they decided to immigrate. The point is that at some point, some of these thinkers said, "Oh, okay, this scientific endeavor that we were part of is now being taken over by the same ideologues we tried to keep away. Now there's also this whole rise of semi-official Soviet anti-Semitism, where where various scientists were trying to essentially gain upper hand over other factions by trying to, let's say, push out all the Jewish researchers from this area. But the point is that this was the period of decline, even though research continued. But somehow, like this feeling of synthesis and this excitement of we're going to solve all the problems gave way to Soviet version of hype, where now cybernetics was taken up by people who said, okay, we're going to come up with ways of scientific management of society, and of course we're going to build the radiant communist future and whatnot. But somehow the research continued, and it percolated to the West, because again, because the Cold War, a lot of these ideas were uh, you know um, translated and analyzed. And so now we come to these days. So where are we now? Well, Vapnik immigrated to the United States in 1990, first at AT&T. And there he, really built on some of the ideas that he knew from the past, such as work of Alexander Lerner, who was his first mentor, and these ideas of Eiserman, Braverman, Rosanoyer, and this became something called the support vector machine. So this is sort of one of the first, it was a kind of a dominant model in machine learning in 1990s. It actually worked on small scale, problems of reasonable scale. For example, it was like used. I think they came up with an electronic system for, I think, like recognizing zip codes from like handwritten digits and things like that. And interestingly, Vapnik worked at AT&T under a fellow named Jan LeCun, who is now recognized as sort of one of the originators of, by now, the dominant paradigm, which is deep learning. So everybody in there, and their mother-in-law heard about this now. I mean, this is the stuff that's written up in all the popular press. But interestingly, this is where the connectionists and the analog stuff sort of triumphed. So, like here, we no longer think that just using logic is feasible. It doesn't seem to work. Whereas having these really flexible architectures loosely inspired by the human brain, where like you feed it massive amounts of data, and you have massive amounts of computational resources. Now this whole notion from Eiserman and his colleagues that you have to interact with data sequentially. You have to feed the data, the examples, the experience, one sort of example at a time. It's the only thing that's feasible now because of massive amounts of data. Like you can't even store these huge databases in memory. You really have to kind of feed them in one at a time. Um, and so some of the ideas that really described in the early 1970s, late 1960s, made their way into the mainstream again. So these ideas are finally paying off. Even though, so because of the military-industrial complex role in the Soviet Union, what happened is the computing time was mostly allocated to the military, and the civilians got like their meager computer hours per week. So that means that there was a lot of emphasis on first designing you know algorithms and ideas for efficient use of these resources, and then you had to once again use mathematics to prove that in fact this is going to be as efficient as you say it is, because otherwise you wasted valuable computer time. So a lot of these Soviet ideas and advances were really sort of born out of necessity, since actual computer time was so scarce. Interestingly, so I didn't mention about Alexei Chervonenkis, who was Vapnik's colleague. So he actually he continued working at these research institutes, and then towards the end of his life, he started working at Yandex, which is like the Russian Google, on problems of machine learning. So he actually died not that long ago, I think a few years ago, essentially of hypothermia. He was I think he got lost in one of his regular hikes in some forest on an island near Moscow, and his friends couldn't get in touch with him, and so he froze to death. Kind of tragic end of life to really interesting character. But now it's this interesting time where these early Soviet ideas are coming back. I think some of these books are a lot more people are aware of them. Sort of and it's interesting, at least to me, because what I see being done now, a lot of times, like, it's always a joke. Okay, so here's some interesting idea. Oh, but I can point to a Russian paper from like some obscure publication, like Notices of, I don't know, Tashkent Polytechnic Institute or whatever, that this idea was first published. And it's actually often true. In fact, Vapnik himself came from he got his I think bachelor's degree in Tashkent, and then Lerner noticed him and invited him to work for, I think, a summer in Moscow, and he stayed on. Well, the rest is history that we're still witnessing. And so this is all I have to say. Thanks.
Sorry, I was on mute. That is really fascinating and lots of really cool stuff in there, as well as amazing visuals. I especially appreciated the clip from Death of Stalin. That was a nice touch. But yeah, it's amazing. I didn't really I knew that cybernetics was a big thing in like Soviet Union, and that a lot of people were prosecuted for going into that field, but I didn't have anywhere near this knowledge of detail.
I mean, it didn't suffer the same fate as genetics, again because of the military-industrial complex. Like, Wiener's book was available in English to select few. You had to like sign out copies from, like, I don't know, various special archives. So eventually, like I said, when after Stalin died, they asserted their authority, and they said, "Leave us alone. We're working on this stuff, and we actually need more people to work on this."
So because they were useful, they were allowed to.
Because I mean, okay, nuclear physics was what, atomic physics was, that same way. I mean, even during Stalin's life, but somehow this whole computing and cybernetics, like I said, there were these half-hearted attempts at denouncing it, but they fizzled out, partly because of Stalin's death and this vacuum that it created, and partly because, the people who were pushing it were influential and had a lot of clout. There were still, there were still, denunciations here and there. Like I said, Lerner wanted to immigrate and wasn't allowed to. So for 10 years, he was this persona non grata, as any other refusenik was. But, things were still happening. And a lot of material, there was a lot of flow of information from the West to the USSR and back. And so, yeah, it was an interesting thing. And of course, I didn't talk about any of the, like Soviet versions of mathematical or computational linguistics. I didn't talk about like psychology and like proto-cognitivists like Vygotsky or Luria, for example,
Right.
who also like deserve a lot of mention. But I mean, because it would take like 2 hours or more. But
yeah, can I interrupt you for a second? You have a question.
Yeah.
Mash, do you want to ask your question instead of me reading it?
Sure. You sort of started talking about it. Well, first, thank you very much. Very interesting lecture. But you sort of started, like, mentioned it in passing that there was a lot of interaction, but how much of interaction was there between Soviet scientists and in the West? Did they ever travel to conferences? Did they ever read manuscripts from the West? Or was it sort of like evolving independently, like it was branched out and the Soviet stuff was just being developed in isolation?
It was a mixture. Like I said, Bongard's book, for example, was translated like 3 years after it came out in Russia, and people knew about it. The ABR Izerman et al. Book was never translated, but some of these ideas later became known. But after during at least Khrushchev's times, people were allowed to travel. Of course, there was restrictions. There were probably some like KGB major attached to you or whatever when you traveled abroad, and not everybody was allowed to travel. But Sipkin was. He was invited like at the International Federation of Automatic Control, so he was renowned. Eiserman was renowned, and so there was definitely travel abroad. There was in fact an international congress on sort of on control in Moscow, and some of the early ideas that I think these people became aware of were presented by like Western scientists, for example, from Stanford. There's a very interesting recollection about this hotel that all these participants of one of these conferences were staying at, and one of the floors, like the elevator never stopped at that floor, and it turned out that what that floor was occupied by basically KGB communications specialists who were like eavesdropping on all the hotel rooms, and one of these American scientists accidentally noticed that. So while there was a lot of sort of ideological control, there was actually a great deal of interaction. Like all the top Soviet journals on these fields were translated, promptly within like several months. In fact, this is how I first came across some of these articles, because like right now you can download a whole bunch of these things in Russian, thanks to I guess the effort of like the Russian Academy of Sciences. But for a while, the only way to access these things was like to go to the library and find like the translated versions of these things and like Xerox them. Kids these days don't even know what that is. And for example, some of the early works on sort of formulating the problem of learning from data, like 1962 and thereabouts in the West, were known to Russia as well, in Russia as well. And in fact, like these ideas of Vapnik and Cheronenkis, partly that they were, they read some article like written in top, engineering journal in the West, and they're like, this makes no sense. This guy is wrong. We need to like come up with our own theory for this. So yeah, I mean, there was actually plenty of interaction, but some of the stuff was still behind the Iron Curtain, and it's interesting to unpack why some of the things were translated and some were not. But I mean, I'm sure there are lots of interesting sort of tangled reasons for why that is.
I think Max Abelov has a question.
Yeah.
Yes, that I do. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm sort of stuck on something that you said early on, and that is that this epic battle between symbolists and connectionists, which defines early cybernetics, and any cybernetics, in the West
Right.
wasn't really like a a, a big as much of a big deal in Soviet work. And this, of course, this whole debate of whether you build smart machines by crunching symbols or by just having these massively parallel connectionist nets. It's sort of, at least in Western science, it's really connected to this even more epic like battle between sort of the rationalist and the empiricist
Right.
view within cognitive science. Within is
It came later though, right?
the most interesting thing about intelligence is like what we can learn from the environment, or the things that we cannot learn from the environment, and I'm just wondering, because while Soviet science was obviously a lot more politicized and ideological than Western science, or so we think. I mean, on this particular issue, it seems like the ideology, the history of Western cognitive science is one big ideological battle. So I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about how does that reconcile, and what are your guesses as to why this became such a stumbling block that it's nobody can complete a sentence about cognition without taking a stance of whether it's learning and nurture or innate ideas in nature. But it seems like this in Soviet science that was they weren't nearly as worried about it.
I mean,
how
they had their own
did
debates.
it come to be this way?
Well, okay, so obviously my view is limited. Based on what I know, I can offer a few sort of conjectures or like ways toward explaining this. I mean, obviously there were their own ideological battles in Soviet science, but the reason why this sort of paradigm shift from connections into symbolism didn't really seem to affect Soviet cybernetics and AI research is because, like, the sort of the paradigm cybernetic device, which of course was later supplanted by logic in the West, was the servo mechanism, like the feedback control system, which to Wiener was like completely analog. But to Soviets, the main thing that was supposed to execute all the control functions was a digital computer. They really were fascinated by this, that like all of a sudden you can transition from like these analog computers, funky devices like rheostats and whatnot, to these things that can manipulate zeros and ones and you can actually program. So because this notion of a computer being used, but it's also connected to things in the world, and things in the world really are analog and squishy. And this actually may have been sort of one of the positive sides of some notion of dialectical materialism, that this idea that like, okay, so everything is described in terms of matter, but biology is, it's something that you study partly by analogy. So there's no way to digitize, biology, but but you process it, you reason about it digitally. So because of and in fact, in the West, this idea that like this idea was precisely kind of espoused by theoretical biologists. It was a different community from AI, but to them, this whole, okay, it's unmistakable that there's clearly symbols, that's DNA, like the things are symbolic. Like some information is transmitted symbolically and manipulated in some sort of a computational discrete way, but ultimately, like the phenotype, right? The actual structure of the organism, the way it's implemented is squishy and analog. So there's no tension here. Somehow, like, you need both. And it seems that somehow the Soviet thinkers also were thinking, but were thinking in this way. Like this conflict is completely artificial because you think about computers as a way of implementing decision rules or control strategies, and they're digital because of their superior performance. Like they're less sensitive to errors and noise, they're easier to program, but somehow they're still interacting with the analog world. So that's why I don't think there was this much of a tension. It was more more pragmatic in some sense. And like I said, just based on my reading of what theoretical biologists in the West were doing. Actually, one of them was this guy named Nicholas Rashevsky at the University of Chicago, who, he was born in Russia, and then ended up in.
Uh, is it just us who lost audio, or
I
everybody?
I accidentally muted Max.
Okay. Is he
Okay.
aware that?
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, I
So
think he's back on.
when anyway, so as I was saying, like the way I see it now, I think people who are working on theoretical biology, to them this whole, like, they have a name for this called the symbol matter problem. Like, they say, okay, obviously, okay, everything has a material basis, but clearly somehow there are symbols, because we're a symbolic species. There's this really nice book by Terence Deacon that's called that way. But but at the same time, we're analog and squishy. So how can we formalize this? So biologists, they were groping towards this, and there are some interesting ideas. And somehow in AI, like, computer scientists wanted a sharper demarcation between these things, which I think is misguided. But it is what it is. You can still hear me, right?
Can I ask a question about sort of the work itself that they did, like the
Yeah.
nature of it? I mean, were they basically, did they run any of these? Like, did they test these architectures out? Or
Yeah.
was it, yeah, they did. So it wasn't just theoretical kind of.
Within their capabilities, they did test them out. Like I said, I mean, like they these are obviously, from today's perspective, these are laughably simple. But I mean, based on some of the recollections I read, Mark Eiserman's lab had like some sort of a machine that could like classify snippets of Bach versus Mozart based on like audio recordings. So yeah, I mean, they tested them out. And like I said, for example, Bongard's combinatorial recognition system was actually used in like some oil exploration, and there were other things. So yeah, I mean, they tested them out, but of course, from today's perspective, these are like just laughably small scale problems. But given the fact that where computers were in like mid 60s and 70s, it was no small feat. But like I said, the fact that first they had to spend a lot of time on pen and paper convincing themselves rigorously that these things that they're proposing will actually be worth implementing on however little computing time they had, is also to me like a great testament to the lasting nature of these contributions. So yeah, they definitely tested them out. And of course, later, like when Vapnik came to the West and these things like support vector machines were actually implemented on like modern computers, it turned out a lot of these theories were right on the mark.
Thanks.
Was an amazing lecture, Max. Hi.
Hello. Hey.
Hey. And yes, I would love for you to continue and give a follow-up lecture on, tie-ins to psychology or linguistics, or just, go right into cognitive science.
And then of course I'm
Yeah, I second the cognitive
none of those
science.
things, but like it's somehow, I don't know, this had been like the like everybody I guess can talk about like their pandemic year. This has been my pandemic year. It was partly actually kind of like the impetus came from Sveta, my wife, who gave like this amazing series of lectures at Georgia Tech on our sabbatical, like the sources of computer vision, and she sort of like dug into so many ideas related to like psychology and cognitive science. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's some interesting philosophical ideas there. And I just kind of started reading all these things. I used to read a lot of philosophy back in the day, and then somehow I stopped. But then I picked it up again, and and then now I see where AI is headed today, and I'm like, okay, so why are we in fact neglecting all these insights that came from, first of all, like the Soviet scientists, but secondly, like I said, from like theoretical biologists and psychologists? So I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something to that.
Or Lana can give a lecture.
Oh, she definitely.
Yeah, is Lana giving a lecture?
I don't know. You'll have to talk her into it.
Does anyone have any other questions? I know Kogan was wondering about self-driving cars.
What about self-driving cars?
When are they coming, and when is one being parked in his driveway?
I
No,
don't
no,
know.
seriously, like we're talking about all this machine learning and
Right.
all this complicated
Well, this
stuff.
is
but, like,
yeah. So this is
I
like,
was just getting at where is the what's the state of all this now? Like,
the state. Okay, so the state is nowhere near like full autonomy as far as I can tell, and partly it has to do with the fact that, again, like the way human drivers operate has been neglected in favor of, oh, we're just going to throw this massive neural net is going to learn everything. But okay, so there's always, whenever somebody says, why aren't you trying to imitate human drivers, the answer is, well, we didn't imitate birds when we developed heavier than air aircraft. That's true, but at the same time, this is a lot more complicated because driving involves other humans who are pedestrians or other drivers, and the way humans apparently seem to operate. And this was actually noted by various Germans in the 19th century first, like Helmholtz or Hertz, is that we tend to a lot of our mental processing is prediction. So we're trying to play things out mentally, like a few seconds before they actually happen. And this is how we tend to live our lives, in particular drive. So if we try to take some of these ideas and apply them to self-driving, and I think a lot of people are working on this, but right now everything is like, okay, you have to first use this neural network to learn the terrain or something like that, and then use these these sensors to go directly from what you observe from all these sensors to actions. That's not how it really works. And so until somebody realizes that not we won't have full autonomy. At least that's sort of my opinion, as like a theoretical controls engineer. So yeah, I mean, that's I'm pretty sure that some of these ideas of like Soviet neurophysiology, like Bernstein, for example, would come in handy as well. He actually was kind of fascinating. He in 1920s and 30s, he would use like a movie camera to record people performing various work tasks, like a worker, skilled worker using their tools, and was actually able to confirm that there's some sort of feedback loops going on, which kind of contradicted Pavlov's teaching. And his book that he published, it's a neurophysiological book. There's this amazing synthesis of like neuroscience as it existed in like 1940s. So I think some of these ideas, once again, sort of are rediscovered by all these companies. Like they're also looking at, let's say, reflexes of like jumping spiders or ants. Like how do these insects react to things? So I don't know. I think the more actual engineers and physicists come into this, the faster progress we can have.
There was a question somebody asked about neural nets. I actually also had one. So that my limited understanding of neural nets is that you feed a bunch of data into them, something happens, but the computer scientists don't understand what happens. From what that's been my reading. They understand that they learn somehow, but
right.
But nobody knows how they do what they do.
Right.
And if so, does that bother you?
Not
that
really.
Sounds spooky to me.
No, I mean, well, okay.
Well, that's the risk, right?
Right, that's the risk. But on the other hand, okay, so I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I watched her learn to ride a bike. I don't think any of that process in her mind is interpretable.
Sure.
But
but her mind is not constructed by human beings. This is something that human beings constructed, and it operates in a way that we don't understand how it operates. That's weird.
Right. I mean, no, I see that. Your mind is also kind of, I'm not, and of course, like a lot of these sort of, luminaries in AI, they, wave these things away and they say, oh, it's not a concern. I mean, I think it is a concern. But on the other hand,
even on a purely philosophical level, it's kind of just spooky.
But at the same time, okay, so a good analogy for that is legal proceedings. When there's a trial, like a murder trial, and all of a sudden you start digging into like, why did you make this decision? What went through your head at the time, etc. Like, there's no way to reconstruct this, right?
Sure.
It's and partly it has to do with the fact that our reality as we live, like, you know, it's co-constructed, you know, by our mind and the outside world. Like,
Right.
they're escaping this. So I don't know. I mean, these are important philosophical questions, but somehow there's sort of a lot of pragmatics going on. I mean, I think right now people are trying to sort of, you know, think about neural nets, you know, with the view of making them more interpretable. But it's the same thing applies to like biological systems or humans. Like, neuroscientists still don't know. Like, neuroscientists still don't know how olfaction works.
Right.
There's some ideas, but like, you know, because vision or hearing is this, you know, example you can sort of map onto a neural net, and it's more or less, you know, okay, so you lose some essential features, but you know, but some of the other essential features are preserved. Olfaction, on the other hand, is just completely weird thing that, you know, that we still don't have any mathematical models of how it works. But it, you know, clearly we all use it, and it works somehow, right? So yeah, I mean, these are all just philosophically. It's all. I don't think we're anywhere near, you know, resolution of all these things, which is, you know, why I'm kind of optimistic that these questions won't go away, you know, and so I can still continue working on these things.
I actually just heard a talk last week between Harari and Kahneman, which was kind of fascinating. And like, but it's to the same point, Harari was going on and on about how, you know, we're entering the age when algorithms are going to take over and are basically going to either run the humankind or make all the decisions that the humans are used to making and have been making for ages. So there's definitely a fear involved with algorithms getting too smart, and how we're gonna keep track of them or QA them, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there's that, but on the other hand, there's also this notion that like basically AI is defined by, you know, allowing, you know, endowing computers with whatever capabilities we don't have at the moment. Like, as soon as you know, and as soon as computers become proficient at something, you say, okay, this is no longer AI. This is solved, right? So.
Yeah, I guess it's just interesting what are we going to do when all the major decisions about us are going to be made by computers.
They already made to a large extent, right? I mean, you know, also, and these things are fairly opaque. Like, there's this really cool book called The Black Box Society by Frank Pasquale, who's he's a legal scholar, but he's exploring all these things through this sort of, you know, angle of you know, humans interacting with essentially unaccountable, you know, algorithms. So there's this notion of like auditing, you know, algorithmic decisions. But on the other hand, like you run the risk of this becoming another bureaucratic nightmare where you know, auditing also becomes this, you know, another thing that ultimately, you know, prevents understanding or something like that, which is also this other book called Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, where he was like, well, you know, once you start quantifying things to make them more administrable, this is where you lose local knowledge and, you know, and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's these are all, you know, fascinating questions, but I you know, also because I understand limitations of engineering and science, I think at some point this, you know, hubris at mathematizing nature, like going back to Husserl, that has to be, you know, we have to resist it, and we have to actually, like, you know, think about this from like a legal and social perspective, and that's not mathematizable. It's you know, it's human affairs.
Maybe just a general question for the non-experts. I mean, given your understanding of, say, like the way the brain works and your knowledge of sort of machine learning, do you think that to actually get sort of closer to general intelligence, I mean, some kind of architecture structure is missing, or it's just more compute, or what?
Okay. Okay. Given my, you know, current thinking, okay, so what's missing is really some notion of embodiment. It doesn't have to mimic humans, but it is something that provides, you know, interaction between, like I said, symbols and matter, right? Because the world outside is not computational, it's not symbolic. Like the solar system does not compute, by, for the planets to move around. It just does its thing because of the configuration of, masses in space-time, right? So we have to get better at I think, like sensors, like the way of interacting with the world. Not everything has to be replaced by computation. Some things just have to be non-computational. Some things are just, like an interface between, analog and computational stuff. It doesn't have to be implemented biologically, but the sooner we sort of think about this in terms of, like, it's this in things that are pure syntax. That's the computation, zeros and ones, bits, symbols, whatever. The sort of things like evolution is that kind of process, because it stores and propagates information through time digitally through DNA, but ultimately this information is instantiated through phenotypes, which are squishy and analog and noisy, and like things swim in like solution in cells, and or there's a lot of random thermal motion in the brain and stuff like that, and nevertheless this thing works, and somehow like nature took billions of years to optimize all of this, whereas we're trying to brute force it by by computation. But because non-computational, these matter to symbol interactions are missing, I think this is where like the stumbling block is.
Max, so on that point, so is it, correct me if I'm wrong, but like for an animal, or for an animal, that embodiment, that connection between the computational and the non-computational comes from you acting on the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
So basically what you're talking about is just, like there needs to be a certain problem there that that sort of makes that connection that,
Exactly.
that the organism is solving, right?
Yeah, I think so. There are a lot of interesting like things, like this paradigm of what's called now self-supervised learning, where you kind of evolve your own goals and you seek sources of information that are somehow useful to you. But again, if it's purely computational, sort of like syntactically and semantically closed, it's going to be just a finite system, right? It's not going to all of a sudden evolve new capabilities, because like it's still limited.
And that would be how you characterize, AI right now. It's still a self-contained computational system.
Yes.
So you're basically saying that you have to put it in an open system, essentially.
Yeah, but not only that, but there has to be some interface to something that's non-computational.
Right.
So like just interesting. There were actually some the British cyberneticists who tried to build systems based on like electrochemistry that somehow like in some sense grow new senses. It was very, very limited. Actually, some of these ideas ended up in like electronic music through Brian Eno. So.
But is there some evidence, for example, that like if you engineer something like this that has certain sensors that begins to navigate, let's say, an environment, that it develops some kind of model of self?
Yeah,
I mean,
homunculus has not really been solved yet.
I mean, right, exactly. I mean, like there's obviously some quote unquote model of self, and like we have proprioception, interoception, so we're clearly modeling something. We're not aware of it most of the time, and that's a good thing, because like if you were aware of it, that would create all sorts of interesting problems. But I don't know. I mean, I know that there are right now there's this there are ideas at the interface of AI and biology. Like people are building artificial organisms that are actually partly biochemical. There was just recently I found out about a really fascinating Hungarian chemist, Tibor Ganti, who proposed this notion of like what constitutes a living system, and this minimal sort of notion of life in like 1960s, also working in relative isolation. And his notion was sort of this from first principles, he arrived at something that's at the same time biochemical. It has to metabolize things. It has to like maintain itself by consuming resources, but also self-catalyzing, but also preserving information about itself digitally through something like DNA. So I don't know. I mean, like a lot of these ideas are now, only starting to be explored. So I don't know. I think this is kind of an interesting thing. All right, I think I better get back to my parental duties and such. So thanks a lot. This was truly awesome. I thanks for like suffering me talking about these things and communicating about these things. It was truly a great sort of thing.
Mhm.
No, Max, it was really great, and thank you for this amazing talk. And a special thank you for not including any formulas. It's from me personally,
Right.
as promised. Yeah, and maybe like you said, maybe if you want to do a follow-up one on cognition, that would be actually really cool.
I would have to
I
do
would
it
personally love that.
sometime in the summer, I guess, because
Yeah.
I still have we still have to survive like the Zoom, the teaching over Zoom and whatnot, which not
Right.
great. All right. Thanks a
All
lot.
right. All right. I will
Thank you.
send you a recording tomorrow. All right. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks.